Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello and welcome to another edition of Musical Talk. I'm Thos and I've been thinking that if Cabaret had been written today, the question, what good is sitting alone in your room, would have a rather more obvious answer. And with lockdown and the coronavirus in mind, today's episode is about the attempts, and successful attempts at that, to overcome the problem of how do you run theatre in a time when theatres are closed, and it's in fact dangerous to congregate. Well, there are many answers, but most of them have relied on video in some form, and today we're going to be talking about a pantomime, which has been placed on video for us all to see until the 21st of February 2021. And that pantomime is Jack and the Beanstalk. It's a traditional fairy tale, and the pantomime version of it has been created by Peter Duncan. Now, Peter Duncan, of course, is most famous in this country as being a presenter of Blue Peter in the 1980s. But of course he has a long and respected history in theatre, and in particular in musical theatre. He's appeared in many, many shows, including Barnum. But in the summer of 2020, when it started to become very clear that lockdown and the coronavirus was going to be with us a lot longer than anyone expected or wanted, and pantomimes, which were scheduled to be taking place in November, December and January, around Christmas time in 2020, were starting to be cancelled, Peter Duncan decided that it was a good idea to come up with an alternative, because Christmas without pantomime is scarcely worth thinking about. And so he, in a very ingenious and original way, came up with performing it on film in the summer in his back garden in South London, and also in neighbouring gardens, with professional actors and singers and dancers for us all to enjoy during the festive period, and indeed up to the middle of February, which is the more traditional pantomime period. Indeed, in the Victorian era, pantomimes opened on Boxing Day and very often ran right through to the summer, sometimes having runs of 5 or 6 months. That seems unbelievable, particularly now as pantomime is now deemed to be almost exclusively a Christmas and New Year thing. But can you ever capture live pantomime, live theatre, effectively? And particularly remembering that pantomime is that most interactive of all theatrical forms, particularly in Britain. It is raucous, it is live, it is exciting, and it's raw in many, many ways. Can you capture that on film? Well, that's something we wanted to explore here on Musical Talk, and so in a minute you'll hear a conversation that I had with Tim Saywood about this production. And if you want to find out more about the production, I'll be giving you details at the end, but it can be found on pantoonline.co.uk. So, whilst I go off into the wings to dress up as an enormous goose, let's listen to that conversation that I had with Tim about Peter Duncan's online but live action Jack and the Beanstalk. Musical Talk. Hello, Tim.
Hello there.
Now, I've been told by one of the best authorities that this old world don't mean a hill of beans.
That's right.
But beans are important in other environments. Can you name a few?
Yes, in a tin of Heinz product, basically, and in some other places too. For example, in the back garden of Peter Duncan's house.
Well, a seamless segue if ever I heard one. We should explain this, shouldn't we? This...
No, let's not.
Enigmatically leave it there. Well, goodbye everybody. It's been lovely talking to you.
I hope you enjoyed Musical Talk.
Peter Duncan, very famous performer in this country, both as a presenter in Blue Peter, but also he's been a name in musical theatre for actually a very long time and has done many things. He's one of those people who can turn his hand to most things, but he does have a long history in pantomime.
Yes.
Funnily enough, from his parents, actually.
Okay.
He remembers, he was literally, the 5-year-old boy who was pushed on stage to be a stooge to his father when his father did summer stock shows.
Oh, okay.
British summer stock. This is basically, sort of Pierots and bottlers, as they were known in the 20s, 30s and 40s in this country.
Right.
Known as bottlers because they would do a kind of performance at the seaside, and then one of the cast, quite often a very young Peter Duncan, would walk around with a bottle in which you ask people to put pennies and halfpennies to show their appreciation. Yes. But not beans at all.
No.
We should just say that there is a connection with beans in the show we're going to be talking about,
Yes.
so this isn't just random.
No, it's not the Beans the musical.
It is
we're going
not.
to be talking about today, is it?
But we are going to be talking about Jack and the Beanstalk, possibly
Yes.
the only musical that has the word bean in the title.
And in which the
probably.
Beans talk.
Do they?
Yes, the Beanstalk.
Oh,
Jack and the Beanstalk.
Whack. That took a second.
Yeah.
Quite a long second.
Very old joke, that.
So,
Appropriately for panto.
well, absolutely, from the original Latin, I'm told.
Yes.
So, to cut a long story short, or a long beanstalk down, Peter Duncan saw the way the world was going with all the cancellations of Christmas pantomimes during summer of 2020, which was, of course, the first summer of lockdown,
Yes.
and decided that actually someone needed to do something to make sure there was some pantomime available
At
around
Christmas.
at the Christmas time. So he very cleverly came up with the idea of putting on a performance of Jack and the Beanstalk in his back garden to be filmed.
Yeah.
And the idea blossomed and indeed grew very much like a beanstalk. But apparently originally he was actually going to do it in a guerrilla style using people's mobile phones, and then they were going to stitch it together in a kind
I
of
see, yeah.
make do amend thing.
Well, I think by the time you got to the sort of summer time, you could bubble with people and do various things that made it possible to do more live, or close to live performance anyway, or stuff that looked more like live performance.
He was also very adventurous as well, in the sense of actually he's a man for whom ideas sort of grow and bubble. And so
Yeah.
I suspect it very quickly grew from,
Yes.
let's just do it on cameras, to, right, let's do this properly.
Yeah.
And I'm pleased to say that at the time of recording, that version of Jack and the Beanstalk is still currently available to see online until the 21st of February. Now, I think this is quite interesting, first of all. It's on until the middle of February, which is when I was a boy in the 1970s, when pantomimes finished. They used to finish in February. For me, it was more of a birthday treat, pantomime. I never associated it with Christmas. So for me, it's been rather lovely that
Yes,
this
it's
Jack and the Beanstalk is still
It's
available
unusual,
now.
yeah, because over even the last sort of 2 decades, I would say they've shifted gradually to be mainly a pre-Christmas thing and finishing around Christmas time,
If a pantomime runs into the second week of January, you've done very well.
Yeah,
Yes,
it's unusual,
absolutely.
yeah.
But this Jack and the Beanstalk, well, first of all, we watched it last night and we found it very successful. But there's some odd things about this. So the reason we're talking about this pantomime today is because it's such an unusual rendering of such a traditional and well-known pantomime. Jack and the Beanstalk has been done on stage in Britain for 200 odd years. And that, I think, is the nub of it. It's been done on stage. We're used to a certain stage language for pantomime, aren't we?
Yes, that's right. So you'd have, obviously everything on one stage normally. So yeah, they've had to adapt it to the space that they had, which was the garden basically. So you garden sheds appear in a few times and sort of outhouses and things like that. I don't know if it's a spoiler to say that they go over the garden wall, so to speak, to the next door sort of garden as well. And yeah, they don't really have very many large spaces for dancing except out in front of the house as well.
On the lawn.
Yeah, and it's not done like a stage production where they just sort of, the sets move in and move out and stuff like that. It's not done as live. It's edited together from a small number of locations. And one of the biggest challenges they have, of course, is like, where do you get a beanstalk from and how do you climb it and how do you look as if you're a long way up in the sky when you're really about 5 feet above the garden path in a tree, which is quite the challenge. So therefore it calls for a combination of like suspensions of disbelief. Obviously in a stage, you're in a theatre and you're not in all the places you're in. In a film, the supposition is you try to resemble the thing you're supposed to be in as much close as possible. But they can't do it because they're using stage craft and stage sets and stage costumes, and it's a heightened thing. So they just sort of use that theatrical imagination technique of standing behind a bush and pretending you're looking across the clouds,
It's the very reason I wanted to watch this more than anything else, actually, because, as you exactly said, when you're in a theatre watching a pantomime, the chances are you'll get a painted backdrop, which is actually one of the very few places in theatre you'll still get something as sort of figurative as that, and very few scene changes in a pantomime. For example, Dick Whittington, it's mostly the shop run by the alderman, Fitzwarren, and then the second act might be a ship and then the tropical island before you go back to Alderman Fitzwarren's.
Yeah.
And you've done it in 3 scenes, essentially.
Yeah.
Most pantos work like that. The idea that he was going to film in his garden, well, there's 2 things, isn't there? There's the difference between theatre and film, and how can you make the most interactive of theatrical environments, which is pantomime.
As a film, yeah.
It's because it's a fourth wall breaking thing in theatre. In fact, the most, isn't it?
You have to have audience participation in a pantomime. It doesn't work if you don't. So the way you do it in this format is you have to effectively sort of stop and wait for audience reactions and provoke them, and then hope that they'll do that. So when the villain gets booed, Flesh Creep is the villain who stands in for the giant in the first act. He has to sort of demand that I can't hear you.
Yes.
And
don't you boo me.
And just yes, exactly. And just hope that the children or whoever indeed is watching, the other side of the screen, does do the participation according to cue. I mean, mostly it isn't like individualised, is it? The participation we get in a theatre.
No.
So we're all sort of doing it at once. So it has a lot of that in it.
And the other thing I wanted to see, you've also touched on, is we were talking about how in a theatre it's not a realistic situation. In fact, it's as far from a realistic situation, not just because it's a fairy story and full of magic, but also the scenery does not lend itself to being realistic.
Yeah.
And then if you're filming it in a garden, you're in a garden. The first thing that's different is it's daylight.
Yeah.
And of course, pantomime is always in a dark theatre.
Yes.
The lights go down before the show starts.
That's right.
So this is all done in the glare of daylight.
Yeah.
It's done in a speech marks real environment because it is a garden, and you have to work around that, as you say, with imagination. But it's the oddness of putting in a fairy tale, not at all real, let's break all the conventions of theatre kind of form, into a pseudo-realistic film form.
To be honest,
and how do you hybridise?
There is a precedent for this anyway, and the kind of thing I'd be thinking of would be the comparatively low-budget children's television series, sometimes sort of drama or semi-drama, Rosie and Jim type of thing, in which you have a very constrained amount of location filming you can do. You do it in a small space, and there might be puppetry or various unrealistic elements to it. There's an element of let's pretend to it, and that's fine. So effectively, it is like CBeebies type programming actually that's done on location, where there's an element of play and let's pretend that the garden is this world. I think a lot of children would be very familiar with that sort of language of TV from watching.
It's so less jarring.
CBeebies or stuff. Yeah.
Funnily enough, the flip side for me is seeing Stephen Sondheim's Into the Woods at the Regent's Park Open Air Theatre, where they incorporated the trees from the park into the back of the set.
Yes.
So you had real trees. That's 100 years in the making, that set.
Yes, exactly.
And it really added, I thought, to that production, although you wouldn't want every production to be like that. No. They were able to use something most unusually. Nothing is more realistic than the thing itself.
Yes, that's true. Yeah, exactly. I mean, as I say, the biggest challenge that's something is in a little sort of world of real plants, that the beanstalk is the one that's not available, and they do resort to just using a tree, and that's fine.
Yeah.
I think
Although they wrap a beanstalk round it, so it's not.
Yeah, they sort of again, it's all sort of with a little bit of imagination and goodwill, it works.
Now you've mentioned the imagination because there's a framing device, isn't there?
Yes.
Which actually sets up. Let's use our imagination, everybody. Do you want to describe that?
Yes, that's right. So Peter Duncan is there as himself at the beginning, talking to his granddaughter, I assume.
Yeah.
And reading her or her asking for a story, and then he sort of basically says, he does frame the thing and say, well, maybe we can have our own story right here in lockdown, and if we can just use our imagination to make the garden into another world. And so that's before he appears as the dame, as he's later going to. And I think they also borrow the postal worker, who's played by Nicola Blackman, who then becomes the garden fairy, and assorted other people around, including a grumpy uncle or Grandpa Ian, is it?
Ian Talbot character.
Ian Talbot, of course. Talking of the open air theatre.
Yes,
he used to be its director, didn't he?
He did, yeah.
And so he gives us I don't know who the character normally is in Jack and the Beanstalk. Who's he playing?
Well, he's playing Squire Shortshanks here.
Right, okay, which isn't a regular Jack and the Beanstalk character.
He's the landlord who forecloses on Dame Trot's house normally.
Yes, a little Allworthy or sort of not Allworthy, like in Dick Whittington. What's the fella's name?
It's Alderman Fitzwarren in
Alderman Fitzwarren. Yeah, he's that sort of character anyway. Yeah. And so that, and plus it's sort of stratified because they have a professional cast of 6 principals, I think it is, who play Jack and Jill and Dame Trot and aforementioned Ian Talbot, and then 2 other speaking parts, the fairy and Flesh Creep.
Yeah, or Flesh Creepy, as his name is actually.
Okay, all right, fair enough.
Who was Joss Van Tyler.
Then they have a sort of supporting cast of mainly dancers, or young sort of studenty types, and including one who does the voice of the giant later on the physicality of the giant. A couple of dancers, and then that's supplemented with, one assumes, Peter Duncan's family plus neighbours who were able to come round and sort of, in a socially distanced way, make up the
crowd scenes.
The crowd scenes, exactly, at the beginning and the end. And so, yeah, that's quite charming, really. They've also borrowed a lot of props in from theatres which would have been sort of unused props this year.
Well, there's not that much call for a pantomime cow in the middle of summer anyway, I always
think.
No,
exactly. I mean, they just don't work, do they, the poor loves, even in a normal year. So it's a big blow for them.
Well, they're used to churn, obviously.
Yes. And so you have a giant costume and bits of castle set and stuff like that. Yeah. You can see that they borrowed those in from whichever... I mean, it said the producers was Everyman, and I assume that was connected with the Liverpool Everyman Theatre on the grounds that there were a couple of sort of Scouse or near Scouse accents in the principal cast. But I'm guessing, I don't know if they carted all of that stuff down from Liverpool or...
I believe it's the Everyman Cinema.
Ah, okay.
They've actually supported by 2 cinema chains rather than 2 theatrical chains.
Gotcha. Oh, that makes sense, because then that's how the thing...
And it has been broadcast in cinemas in a socially distanced way, in a way, during the period when that was possible.
Yes, yeah. Okay, well, there you go then. So that's the connection.
Also, while we're on that subject then, we better briefly mention that when we watched it, they do, of course, climb the beanstalk and get to the ogre's land in the sky, which is a sort of castle-y kind of thing, and we identified it as being... we assumed someone had knocked it up and put it in a nearby yard, but it turns out to be a folly in the next-door neighbour's garden.
Is that right?
So, exactly right. So that's why they used it. So
Well. Yes, it looked like a set to me. But,
So we've got these conceits and we've got things pulling in different directions or potentially pulling in different directions. The traditions of live theatre against film, the traditions of non-realistic setting against a realistic environment in which the acting is taking place. And of course there's also the issue of, we all know Jack and the Beanstalk. How is it going to work? So there's actually that dichotomy of, can you squeeze that story into this new fit? Let's talk generally. Was it a success, and why?
I found myself carried along by it. I mean, just because you wanted to succeed, I think, in the current circumstances. You don't particularly... There's so little theatre obviously being done, and...
it's the goodwill almost, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. You just sort of... Well, and also it is, I suppose, refreshing to have it done in a different way, unless you're going to be really picky. It's nice to have a new take on it. So, yeah, by and large, I think it worked. It couldn't have the lighting and atmosphere of those things. It does feel like a thing that's been done outside on location, and so it has a slightly concrete quality to it, I suppose, that tends to play against the costumes and things. They're not being enhanced to their maximum effect. Like the giant doesn't look as imposing as he would, with quite a lot of darkness on stage
and a shadow, up a wall.
And, exactly.
Yeah, it's quite.
There's certain ways that the theatrical environment could have enhanced what you see.
And actually, the bright colours of the dame's many, many costumes.
Yes, there's a lot of fluorescence sort of.
Yeah, she has 12... Peter Duncan has 12 dresses.
Right.
As Dame Carolina Trott.
Yeah.
But of course the colours don't stand out in the way they would in a lit environment in the theatre. They're in daylight and in a garden, which is all green.
They were all UV as far as I could see.
Well, plastic is so wipe downable, isn't it? Oh, that's PVC.
PVC. Yeah, no, UV as in ultraviolet.
Yeah.
Like what they call day glow.
Yeah.
And so I think probably they were chosen for that sort of reason.
Full on, yes.
Yeah, exactly. Because usually you only need those colours in a panto costume when you're doing the dark light sequences, in the second act usually. So
under the sea kind of thing. When the ship goes down in Dick Whittington, absolutely, yes, quite. So I agree, and I agree with you. I think the point you make about the goodwill going a long way here. I mean, it's asking you to support it in the sense of it says, look, we're doing this. We know this isn't quite how you're used to it, but this is better than nothing, and it's a jolly good fist of it, I think. So I was completely won over by it.
Yeah, no, I think the enthusiasm is great, and I think they did have a very good cast actually. They have the Jack and Jill, both sort of very witty players.
That's Sarah Moss and Sam Ebenezer. The
guy who does Flesh Creep has got a really interesting variety of accents that he deliberately does, sort of slips between them in one scene, and so that's a bit of a showcase for his show reel later on.
Well, he's called Jos van Tyler, and I've subsequently researched him because he was very good as Flesh Creepy. Actually, he has a sinister approach. He's actually from Ireland. He's an Irish actor, but only lived there for 6 years.
Right.
So I suspect travelling at least must have given him access to different accents.
We certainly had Australian, South African, we had Irish. We also had, I don't think we had Scottish. I'm trying to think. We had Scouse though, didn't we? At one point?
Yeah, and there were several unidentifiable accents as well.
One or two that I wasn't quite.
I mean, we should say this scene was played deliberately to do this. He was trying to fiddle,
be an unconvincing
salesman,
imposter. Yeah,
that's right. So he was trying to fiddle Jack out of the cow not for gold but for beans, and he does all these accents. So he's immediately shown to be fake. Actually,
we have a traditional Shlosh Scene in there as well, where they dance around and do a sort of little routine. In fact, there was a lot of it relied heavily on the routines. I mean, obviously all panto does, but there was a slosh routine, and there was a sort of a dance routine. If I were not upon the stage, they did.
Yes, that's right. Some of the old stalwarts were there.
Things which just have nothing to do with the plot, don't take you anywhere, but are just sort of silly or funny in themselves.
And the sing along, of course. So there was a sing along.
Yes, there was a sing along. Yes, that's right. Which they did. Why does a brown cow give white milk when it only eats green grass?
I mean, that's the vital question.
That's the burning question. Yes.
What is your suggestion?
Well, give me your suggestions. Yeah, so we had that as well, and so it was very Dame-led, which is exactly what you'd expect. I mean, most pantos are.
Yeah, and Jack is very much so.
Yes, I mean that's right. Yeah, exactly. Because and I think where they had major challenges was in the sort of trying to make the going up the beanstalk sequences. Those were the hardest ones to sort of make work, just with the resources they had. But I think they made it. There was one, for example, rather well shot scene where it was just down from a sharp angle above, because they did have a crane, you could tell at the beginning. And they sort of sent a lot of smoke underneath the trees, so you couldn't quite see where the floor was. Unfortunately, the smoke blew away after a few moments, and you could suddenly see they were only about sort of 4 foot off the ground, sort of thing.
But that's not the point, is it? Because, as you say, they'd set the scene. You were above the clouds.
Yeah, you knew roughly.
That's after that, you know where you are. Quite. Yeah. I thought they were quite interesting in how they dealt with one or two of the entrances that you might not normally get. So the dame would normally come on looking for Jack or something like that. But in this case, we actually start with the dame in bed under her duvet.
Oh yes,
and there's quite a lot of sort of rumbling and agitation beneath the duvet, and then the duvet is thrown away, and the dame is there in her bedgown and introduced that way. You never see the dame domestically, first of all, and here we are in her bed, the most domestic of all things. Yeah, as always, there's a comedy, or don't look at my pants shot kind of thing. Yes, but that's okay with a dame. Yeah. And then, actually, as you see her walk through her... It's the outside garden shed, isn't it? In fact, they make a point of that. I live in a shed, it's not really a cottage. Yeah. And so as the camera pulls through the shed away from her, as she's sort of getting up and getting ready, you see all her costumes on the wall. Yes, that's right. So it's her wardrobe, Actually, it's quite nice, but, because you never actually see the dresses in a pantomime. It's just taken for granted they're in the wings.
Twanky and they're doing washing. But yeah, no, it's true. It is a nice touch. And it was a very coherent sort of dame setup in the sense that there was a consistency of colours and things like that, it felt like a single, as it were, dame. The interesting one choice they made or decided against was they didn't go for heavily digital effects to try and sort of compensate for the things. They didn't try and enhance reality. The only time they do it is where they used pre-recorded sequences, which I'm guessing came from other pantos, where the dame flies with her balloons across sort of many different landscapes using a bit of green screen.
Although even so, I mean, you say that, but yes, you're right. But she wasn't animated. Peter Duncan as the dame was holding physical balloons.
Green screen, yeah, exactly.
And then, as you say, she was made to fly up because they needed to find. Jack's gone up the beanstalk, so they've got to find a way of getting the dame up there, haven't they? Yeah. So she's accidentally given some balloons and is sort of loft. And then there's a 2-minute sequence where she almost gets dropped in a river, and then she meets Aladdin on his flying carpet.
Which is a sort of new tradition in panto. Suddenly, the big video sequence that sort of goes out. The various Boggle Vision, I think, the Kudos people did, and that sort of thing.
There's a lovely moment in that sequence, by the way, where she very nearly, as I say, gets her feet wet by dropping in the water, and we can hear a harp. Because there's a live harp player in the filmed sequences up in the Giants area, but there's a harp player, and the harp player plays the Blue Peter theme tune as a part of the incidental music to remind you that Peter Duncan is of that ilk.
Right. Oh yeah, that's right. I forgot about that. So so there's not too much reliance on sort of digital effects or sort of things. One interesting thing that they did, you notice in retrospect, is that because it was filmed in what looks like the sort of mid to late summer of 2020, you don't have very many topical gags.
Yes.
And so, but the first scene with the dame must have been filmed a lot later because there's a joke in there about getting the orange man out of the White House.
Yes.
Which clearly post dates November the 5th or whatever. So or whenever they had the election.
Or could have been dubbed later on.
I don't think it was dubbed.
No, I don't think it was, but it could have
done.
been, yeah.
It was done on the spot. So I think they even allowed to sort of do what you would normally do, and so held that scene back to be filmed later by the looks of it. And so that was a nice touch. You know, it was it made it sort of very relevant. I mean, the material itself clearly was all sort of recycled from other Jack and the Beanstalk scripts. And,
yes. Well, it's not only so far you can take it.
I think they built up the fairies part a little bit to sort of help be a narrator character. And those were nice. Yeah, it was a combination of sort of old songs that got adapted for the purposes of Jack and the Beanstalk, and even Gustav Holst's Jupiter.
Yes.
I Vow to Thee, My Country, you know, which was used as the climax of Act 1 song and also the very final number as well. There was a nice one about The World Is Your Oyster, which goes at the end, which is a company number.
And makes reference to something that's actually thrown away as a joke earlier on.
Yes.
Someone says the world is your oyster. That sounds a bit fishy to me.
Yeah.
was the good old music hall gag. Yeah. Well, maybe this is a time to briefly look at the score then.
Yeah.
So there's a very short overture, if you like, introducing us to the scene. And then we've got the first chorus number, where everyone, including, as you say, the next door neighbours, all holding up placards.
Yeah, well, that's right, yes.
And the song's called Lockdown.
So Jack and the Beanstalk is often supplemented with a sort of environmental theme, because the Green Fairy, or she's not called the Green Fairy.
She's the Garden Fairy,
the
but yes.
Garden Fairy, yes, is...
she's very ecologically aware.
Yeah, she's exactly. It's very and so in this particular version, the giant is held up as an example of sort of a cyborg type of giant who's sort of all about synthetic things, you know.
Well, he's described as being part plastic.
That's right, exactly. So I mean, it's, you know, so that sort of theme is in there, and so that's what the protests at the beginning are about. They're sort of a climate / in lockdown type of protests.
But the placards are generally on the amusing side, aren't they? So they're making a point, but there's one that says, you know, down with this kind of thing,
which is from Father Ted. Yeah,
yeah, and more of that ilk.
Yes, exactly. Yes, and I forget the others, but they're very good.
So the song Lockdown is the kind of, it would usually be welcome to our town, we are the townsfolk.
Yes.
And that's still essentially what we're getting, but they're talking about lockdown. There's a very gentle theme. There's several very gentle themes in the entire production that I'm sure we'll talk about. But one of them is about being reassuring to younger viewers that actually lockdown is, you know, and the world we're living in is a bit strange.
Yeah.
There's lots of throwaway references. It's not overburdened, not overdone, about things getting better or let's overcome chaos. And in Lockdown, there was a chorus that said, "It's nothing forever," and the lyric was, "It's nothing forever. This living together, whatever the weather, forever and ever and ever in lockdown."
Yeah,
which is actually, unfortunately, the lyrics went a little bit fast to be able to be heard. I've had to listen to it on the recording subsequently. But it's interesting to me that that's actually the opening theme is, look, you know, don't worry, it's not going to be like this forever.
Yes.
Then the next song is a reworking of a tremendously old song called Carolina in the Morning.
Yes.
Now, she's been carefully named Dame Carolina Trott.
Yeah.
And her song is called, as you say, In the Garden.
Nothing could be finer than to be with Carolina in the garden, isn't it? Yeah.
Or strolling like a girlie through the kale that's green and curly in the garden. Butterflies all flutter up. And kiss my little buttercup. And that's the name of the cow, of course.
Oh, I see. I did wonder.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I thought that was a sweet, rendition of that song. I mean, they have, again, you know, the scores are slightly harder to balance in that sort of environment, but it seemed like they probably dubbed it and then mimed to it was how I would have thought. That's how it looked to me.
It would be the most sensible precaution anyway if you're recording outside.
Yeah,
There's aeroplanes over London and
Les Mis methods and
yes, of course,
and have it all sung live on the set.
I quite like the orchestration of that one because I mean the backing for most of the songs is a kind of sort of synthy sound, to be honest.
Yeah.
But that one was given a kind of a tuba, or it was every now. I quite like the fact that the dame, if you like, is accompanied by a tuba. That sort of fits her character as well, and that's just a little musical joke. I thought
it just gives the whole thing a slightly lumpy feel.
Now onto the Shlosh song.
Yeah.
Now, as you say, this. Do you want to explain what a Shlosh Scene is?
So this
it's not a German hotel.
No, exactly. This is basically or castle. This is the scene in which people get messy. Basically, there's usually sort of cream pies or custard pies, or there's
bucket of froth,
or there's water in the scene sometimes. I mean, there's various versions of it.
Baking the cake is the main one.
Yeah,
isn't
like
it?
Dick Whittington usually has Sarah the cook, and then that becomes a sort of making a cake type of scene, and the ingredients go everywhere, including somewhat over the audience. And
or Aladdin in the washroom.
Oh yeah, that's
in the laundry area.
That's a classic Shlosh scene as well. I'm trying to think what they have in other ones. In this case, however, Jack and the Beanstalk, there isn't a particular excuse for a Shlosh Scene that's especially relevant to Jack and the Beanstalk.
Which is so important.
Exactly. I suppose in some other versions they might have had the Lady Giant mopping or stuff like that, I guess. But anyway, I don't know. This one is about... What's it about exactly?
Well, if you remember rightly, at the same time they're trying to confuse Ian Talbot's squire because he's just about to foreclose on the mortgage.
Yes.
Exactly.
So it's rent. They don't have a mortgage.
Well, you're right.
They're poorer than that.
I can't hear you, Tim.
No.
But seriously, yes. So Jack and his mother are bamboozling him with it's a food song. It's the Bubble and Squeak song.
That's right.
So if you remember, what they do is they sort of invite him to join them for the food, and then there's a big bucket of froth which they're pretending is beer. And the song, each time they finish the chorus, they all take a swig of the beer from the big bucket.
Yes.
Until they get round to the end of it, where they pour all the bucket over the squire. But the lyric is, and this is at sort of double pace, Bubble and Squeak is not unique, but it's better than baked potatoes. And eating some peas that gives you the fleas is better than squashed tomatoes. A leg of lamb, a hunk of ham, a slice of double primula. And then it's imaginate. It takes us all back. They talk about imagining all the way through it to remind you that you are expected to imagine this. Imaginate what's on your plate and hunger will dissipate. A tummy swell will make you well and wave your problems bye farewell.
Yes. Very nice. Not Shakespeare, but it's very nice.
Is it not Shakespeare?
No, I gather not.
Do you know what is Shakespeare?
And I know because I looked it up.
Well, let me tell you
in
what...
Jack and the Beanstalk.
Let me tell you what is Shakespeare in Jack and the Beanstalk. This I only learnt today.
What?
What does the giant say in every Jack and the Beanstalk?
Fee, fo, fi, fum.
I smell the blood
of an Englishman, yeah.
Do you know where that's from?
No.
It's from King Lear.
Is that right?
He actually says, fee, fi, fo, fum, I smell the blood of a British man. But
Who says it?
Oh, I can't tell you, but it's in King Lear.
I'm going to check your facts on that one.
Okay.
Because I don't remember that from King Lear.
It's when the giant turns up.
Yes, it's that famous scene in King Lear. Know that we have divided our kingdom into the bit up the beanstalk and the bit that isn't. It's on the ground.
Goneril, bring me my singing harp.
Exactly. Let's see if we can get fee, fo, fi, fum.
Fee, fi, fo, fum, surely.
That's what I just said.
Oh.
Poem as given in Joseph Jacobs' 1890 rendition. I smell the blood of an Englishman. Its tetrametric origin. The 1596 pamphlet Have With You to Saffron Walden. Written by Thomas Nashe. This is direct from Wikipedia, guys. Who mentions that the rhyme was already old and its origins obscure. Fi, far and fum, I smell the blood of an Englishman. In King Lear, the character Edgar exclaims, Fi, fo and fum, I smell the blood of a British man. So you're quite right. That's in King Lear. The word is used repeatedly in Shakespeare's works. King Lear shouts fi, and fi, pa, etc. Okay, well, sounds like you're right. It's in King Lear.
Do you think he should get the credit for the writing?
Said by Edgar. Well, I mean, see, he seems to have picked it up from...
Saffron Walden, from a day trip.
Have With You to Saffron Walden, as rewritten by Shakespeare as King Lear. So, yeah, okay.
Well, there we are.
He certainly came to an orderly end.
Oh, good. Smart work.
Yes.
So, the Shlosh Scene we've discussed. And,
yes, the King Lear references we've discussed.
Then there's a kind of little throwaway song for Jack as our hero. He sings a song called Truly Great Adventure, but it's only about a minute long. But it does get reprised when he's about to climb the Beanstalk. So it is very much that kind of, can I be the hero?
Yes.
Shall I be the hero? Should I be the hero?
Yeah.
And then, as you've quite rightly pointed out, Holst turns up.
Yes, as he's wont to do in these circumstances.
With his conveniently written song, which has new lyrics called I Will Climb.
Yeah.
And I think it's worth quoting a couple here. These lyrics are by Peter Duncan.
Or possibly Shakespeare.
Well, people have often muddled the two.
Yeah.
But Peter Duncan has taken because words have been attributed to this song before, as you quite rightly pointed out.
Yes, I bow to thee, my country, all earthly things above, blah, blah, blah.
And it's often identified as a kind of national, if not nationalistic song.
Yes.
It's anthemic anyway, isn't it? So it's got new lyrics. I will climb to stop all cruelty, bring sanity to mind. I will climb to bring equality to woman and mankind.
Yep.
That's just one little double couplet there, but But it's gentle and it's nice, and actually it's a little bit more socially aware than some of the inherited
it's
anthemic lyrics we're used to.
It doesn't get too specific, and
no, of course.
But yeah, there's just a little bit of a dash of as you say, social awareness in it.
Yeah.
Than would have been the case perhaps for the average 1980s type of.
Well, even now,
song.
panto is quite a conservative form, let's be honest.
Yes, it is.
It rarely strays into talking about changing anything. Not that this does very heavily, but it's quite nice that basically Jack's personal anthem is about getting rid of cruelty and bringing in equality.
Yeah, I suppose that's true, yeah. So tyranny is anti-tyranny.
But it's not absolutely clear whether he's climbing the beanstalk, of course, in the plot, in order to save Jill, who's been kidnapped, or whether he's just trying to get his cow back. So it isn't perhaps under
he's given both motivations, because
Yes.
they kidnap Jill quite early on in the plot.
They do.
Which does slightly pull against the equality of
Yes.
opportunity in the...
well, in fairness, he didn't kidnap her. That was flesh creepy.
Yes, that's true. And so she's imprisoned by the giant at the beginning of Act 2, and as you say, the cow is there to be retrieved as well, although they do have rather a difficult job of trying to figure out how to get the cow down the beanstalk.
Which they sort of sidestep in the plot a bit, don't they?
Yes, I think never actually getting sort of...
Push him over a wall.
Solved on camera.
Yes.
But it does get solved, so whoopee-doo, we have a cow.
So I Will Climb by Holst, and it's interesting actually how that piece of Speechmont's classical music fits as comfortably as it does into the score of this piece.
Well, I think it has its long association with rugby and these sorts of things by now, isn't it?
It's a known song, isn't it?
It's a sportsy thing. It's not really thought of as a hymn quite so much now, I think.
And then that would be the end of Act 1, you can sense it. But obviously it's a one-act piece, it goes through for about 90 minutes. So we make our way up to the ogre's den. Now, the ogre is probably worth discussing. It's a man in a suit, one of his suits that sits high upon...
The giant, you mean?
The ogre, the giant.
Oh, okay.
Same thing, isn't it?
No.
What's an ogre then?
Different to a giant.
I don't think you're right.
I don't know.
Let's make him a giant then, all right. Let's talk about the giant.
Yeah.
It's a man in a suit, one of those suits that sits heavily upon the shoulders quite high. So, it's... And, it's very strange. He's green with one eye, so he's a cyclops.
Yes.
He's wearing...
borrowed in from some Homeric adaptation, who knows?
Well, it's not just Homeric, it's also homoerotic, because he's wearing shiny grey short trousers, and he's got a six-pack, even though he's green.
That's true, yeah. He does have a bit of a crop top going on
there,
yeah, that's true. Although he's also got like tubes coming in and out of his belly, isn't he?
Because he's a cyborg.
Yes, I guess so, yes.
And
cyborg with a colostomy.
Yeah, and what would every cyborg want apart from dinner?
I've forgotten, sorry.
Well, Jill trains your wall singing a song.
Oh, that's right, yes.
So he basically threatens her, but unless she sings to him, he's going to eat her. And she sings a song called Bright Blue Butterfly.
Right.
Do you remember?
Yes, I do. It's a sort of a bit of a pause. It's quite sort of a wandery type of a melody. I forget what it's... Well, I thought she was sort of trying to lull him to sleep, but that doesn't happen. Although he does get a bit sort of stupefied by it, doesn't he?
I would too.
Yeah. It's an interesting... Yeah, it's not a very... It's the least trad song in it.
It's also the least memorable in a way, and that's not because of the performance. It's just a little bit of a soppy number, actually.
It does. It doesn't have very strong melodic control in it, and therefore lower memorability.
Yeah. And then we have essentially the Dame and Jack land up in the giant's domain and rescue Jill, and have a few adventures outwitting Flesh Creepy and the giant and the giant's beast, and trying to save Buttercup the cow. But there's still always time for If I Was Not in Pantomime. They can't sing the usual version of it, which is If I Was Not Upon the Stage, a something
Although
I would
actually,
be.
I've seen it done on stage as If I Were Not in Pantomime.
Oh, right, okay, so it's becoming
not
what
a
it is.
new thing, yeah. I think I've seen it more than once. So.
Do you want to describe what that
So this is an
normally
old
features?
Victorian musical routine. So basically, each verse begins with a new one character saying, "If I were not in pantomime, something else I'd like to be. If I were not in pantomime, something me." So it could be, for example, a fireman or a teacher, a nanny, anything, and it doesn't really matter what the thing is. In fact, you replace it every single time, really. Otherwise, it gets boring.
Well, this is, I think, where we step in and say the Dame decided that what she wanted to be if she was not in pantomime was a bottle of Heinz tomato ketchup.
It was a tomato, I would be. That's right.
Yeah,
Although
but she was dressed
the costume was the 57 varieties tomato ketchup.
See, listeners, it does make sense.
And there's then an action with some accompanying words, with I don't know what
a mime to
what
match.
did the tomato to? I can't actually remember.
Well, she was squeezing her bottle, if you remember rightly.
Goodness, well, stagecraft has come on since I last saw a pantomime that routine. But
and Jack wanted to be a driver.
Oh, that's right. So he was spinning round this way and spinning round that way and putting on the brakes. And no, he didn't. He was on a horse. He was a jockey.
That's right. Sorry, it was Jill.
It was Jill who wanted to be the driver. She had a little toy car around her.
Midriff.
Yes. So basically they do that, and then the routines, it speeds up and it goes up a key, and so the first person does theirs through, and then the second person does theirs through, and then the first person does theirs through again, and then the third person does theirs, followed by the second and the first person, and so on until you've got about 6 of them going on simultaneously, and they're doing all these actions, bumping into each other because their actions happen to interfere with the next person's, and then they do it faster, and then they fall over, and then they lose a cue, and it's basically a little.
It descends into chaos.
Comedy chaos. Increasing chaos, and another version you see in Panto is the 12 Days of Christmas, where they have to have, 12 toilet rolls and
a bra that was made to hold three
is usually the final thing. And all the props get lost and thrown into the audience and have to be retrieved, and again it's sort of an increasing chaos type of scene. And it works very well, I think.
Can I say, and we were both very impressed by it here, there is an accompanist to this, a woman,
MD, sort of a humorless musical director.
She's played humorlessly,
acting, exactly, as if humorless, getting increasingly exasperated with the actors and their antics, and finally picking up her sheet music off the stand and stalking off in high dudgeon, basically. Well,
there's a moment, isn't there, halfway through where she just picks the paper up and throws it over her shoulder.
That's right. No one ever stalks off in a low dudgeon, I've ever noticed.
They don't, yes.
It's true. You only really have the high sorts of dudgeons these days, don't you?
Mid-dudgeon?
Perhaps, yes, medium-sized dudgeon, yeah. Or mid-altitude dudgeon. Anyway.
We digress.
We do. So often.
So there's that song, which as you said at the beginning is one of the absolute staples of Panto, and this has been ladled generously with all of these staples, and some tomato, in order to make it feel as
my favourite
is
Ian Talbot, who comes on in the Bernie Clifton style Swan, wanting to be a ballerina in Swan Lake.
Oh, that's right. He's also really good at the business,
the emu stuff. Yeah. So basically, the Swan gets out of his control and starts pecking at the tomato bottle next door, and it's all sorts of. It's beautifully done.
Yeah. And then, if that wasn't enough...
if you weren't exhausted by this point...
well, the next song...
Very much like the MD.
Well, the next song in the piece is Why Does the Brown Cow
Give White Milk when it only eats green grass?
Which I tried to find out who wrote that. Now, to me, that feels absolutely archetypally 2030s. Yeah. That doesn't feel Victorian. It feels like a pre-war pantomime insert, which has just become so classic and ubiquitous... But I cannot find any writing references at all online. It seems to have landed in the public domain somehow.
Sounds like it could even be American to me. Because there are versions that I think you found, wasn't there? There was of a red cow instead of a brown cow, and things that were slightly more Americanised. So.
That's right, and one or two which don't use the word ass.
Yes,
because don't you feel an ass?
Yes, is the
to rhyme with grass.
One of the many rhetorical questions in it.
Yeah.
It's a nice song sheet, and I didn't know if they'd bother with the song sheet. The reason you normally have a song sheet is to cover up all of the changes for the walk down
at the end. Yes,
and you don't need.
It's always a front of curtain job normally, isn't it?
Yeah, so you don't in an edited panto. You don't actually need to have the changing times, as it were. But they kept it in because it's a traditional element.
Yeah,
fair enough.
It's also
and it's an interactive element, and I mean, it seemed to me to be pitched at very young children. The whole thing, and
up
I think
to 10,
it had that
said.
CBeebies feel.
Yeah.
And they would be doing the actions and singing the songs at home. I'm glad they didn't try dividing the audience into two, though, as they sometimes do in the song sheet scene, as that could have been awkward in single parent and single child households.
Yeah, quite.
Well, I suppose anyway. Yeah, it
could have been awkward. Full stop.
It just could have been awkward. Full stop. It would have been a cruel reminder to those watching it by themselves in lockdown.
Yes. So we had
sing it out one side of your mouth and then the other side.
Who won? Because that's the other thing you have to
get to that point, didn't we? Yeah.
But it was nice to see it, and it is almost the. It's oddly reassuring to me, the Brown Cow song. Funnily enough, I don't know why. Mm-hmm. I mean, I can absolutely in my head hear Arthur Askey singing it in a pantomime in the 1930s. Don't you think? I mean, or Stinker Murdoch, or both of them together.
Yeah.
And that, in a sense, as always, more or less brought the plot to the end, several songs before you actually reach the end. Or as you say, in a pantomime production, you would move on to the finale, which would be a song and a walk down and a kind of and a Merry Christmas to you all. But we haven't quite finished in this version. The brown cow has been brought down from the giant's lair over the fence or over the wall somehow. But we're all back on the earth, or the village, and then we do move to the finale, which is The World's Your Oyster, which you've mentioned. Now, I think this has got some hidden political meaning. And let me read you the lyric here. When chaos seems to reign, now's a time to make a start. When idiots rule without a care, you know it will never be fair. It's a great big pantomime. We've got fake hair. I mean, it goes off subject a little bit at the end. But it's interesting that there's a dig at, every now and then, as I say, it takes us back to that very, very gently socially aware and politically aware.
Mild pinpricks of,
It's unlikely to offend anyone.
No.
But I got the general sense that it was veering ever so slightly centristly left rather than centristly right.
I think it was sort of in that marshmallowy sort of centre zone, really.
Yeah.
I mean, motherhood and apple pie sort of thing, but just
hard to be offended by.
Let's save the planet is a generally sort of good message, isn't it, everybody? They had like rainbow gloves and things like that at the end. Little
they did, yes.
Smoke signals, if you like, but barely anything that was.
And yet, at the same time, there was someone wearing a T-shirt saying, "My son went round the world and all I got was his lousy T-shirt." So it was setting up a lot of things.
Yeah.
And that's the score essentially. Oh, then it finishes with a final version of "I Will Climb." It finishes once again with the Holst song, and then we get Jack and Jill kissing, but in a socially distanced way through a sheet of perspex.
Yes, I assume that was a measure they had to do. I couldn't figure out why they would do that otherwise, but it was a perfectly nice thing to end up with, I suppose.
And then the dame kisses the squire in exactly the same way, using a piece of perspex.
Using a presumably different piece of perspex in terms of their...
Health and safety gone mad!
Exactly. It's been a very bizarre year, and particularly for Panto, because obviously theatre... I mean, perhaps a serious point to make here is that theatre has been really devastated.
Oh, yes.
And given that we're still not sure how much longer this is going to go on for, the long-term effects are going to be quite profound, and not least on careers of performers. A lot of performers have been seen to complain on Twitter that, there's rescue money going to various theatres. It is kind of paying the admin staff and not so much doing much good for the actors or the freelancers. So every effort to get people working and doing something in a funded way is obviously a good idea. It's obviously going to be a drop in the ocean of a huge stress on the entire sector, but it's nice for us at Musical Talk to be able to see something that's going on a little bit more with at least a sort of gung ho spirit, going down fighting a little bit. And finding a way to, particularly sort of young people as well, the young performers, because obviously there was that chorus there and so on, who were obviously getting to work, which the celebs have had their talking heads and their sort of
on television,
lockdown dramas and things like that, and obviously those are important too. But it's nice to see sort of just the
fresh out of dance or theatrical school. Yes, quite. Well, there were 35 people in the cast in total. Yeah. And I think that's very impressive. I think at the end of the day, I would have personally have liked a few more jokes in the piece, because I always do. I think a further skim draft with extra jokes. And there were one or two little bit of plot greynesses towards the end, as we've identified. But actually, overall, I really enjoyed it. I know you did too. We laughed a lot. It was done with a lot of heart. Yeah. But obviously a lot of thought.
Yeah, and it might well be that they roll it out, and hopefully they make a new one next year if we're still in the same situation, and hopefully we won't be. But that it's a repeatable experiment. I think one of the big sort of issues with, again, just sort of on the serious side of this, if you make a film, the film is repeatable. So in theory, if there was a further lockdown, what's to stop people just rolling out the exact same film they made this year, and not really paying people again, or except for sort of a reduced fee and so on.
Not that there's any question of that being suggested
here.
No,
I have no idea what the arrangement is here, and I'm not making any assumptions about it. But in general, in terms of what's happened across the sector, and so it's an interesting thing, really, as to how the sector will deal with that, because they've moved. If the theatre will come back,
of course.
But where live theatre is not possible, it's just making sure that there's sort of a fair deal for those involved. Yeah. Who may perform it once on camera rather than on a repeated basis.
And I think that takes us back to where we started from, because although it was good and highly enjoyable and a really positive experience to watch, it doesn't beat being in the theatre. But if you can't be in the theatre, it's still a very good thing to bother with.
Yes, exactly, yeah. If you can't be at them, join them online.
Very good.
Yes.
And you can still do that until the 21st of February. The easiest way is to type in Peter Duncan, Jack and the Beanstalk, or even Peter Duncan online pantomime. All the searches will take you to it, and it's super easy to find. We'd recommend it, I think, wouldn't we?
Definitely. Good way of supporting theatre in the long run.
Right, I wondered if you like some bubble and squeak, a leg of lamb, a hunk of ham, and a slice of double primula before we finish.
The trouble with bubble and squeak is that I understand it's not unique, whatever that means.
It's a rip-off of leftovers.
Yes.
Well, thank you for sharing your hunk of lamb, old chap.
No problem.
Musical talk. And there we are, that was Tim Saywood and me talking about Peter Duncan's Jack and the Beanstalk. And as we said, it was a very successful show and actually managed to make a virtue of almost all the things that made it difficult to do in a recorded form. It is a show well worth catching, and I would recommend that you go and see it. And you still can at the time of broadcast, because it's on and available until the 21st of February. If you want to find out more about the show and how to book tickets, go to pantoonline.co.uk or go to showcatcher.com, which is the platform on which the show is broadcast, and so are several others. So it's also worth looking at what other shows might be available to watch. And that's not the end of Jack and the Beanstalk with Peter Duncan, or at least Peter Duncan's part of it, because next week there's going to be an opportunity to hear the interview that I conducted with him about 10 years ago at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe, when he was performing his magnificent one-man show. And in that conversation, you'll hear a lot more about Peter's own historical show business family roots. And it's absolutely clear that those roots and his early experiences have fed into his version of Jack and the Beanstalk. Give it a whirl if you can. And I look forward to speaking to you next week. But until then, it's time for me to say, goodbye, children, goodbye. Or, more appropriately, just goodbye. This episode of Musical Talk, presented by Thos and Tim Saywood, and edited by Thos. Copyright Musical Talk 2021. To find out more about the world of Musical Talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our website www.musicaltalk.co.uk or subscribe to us on iTunes and follow us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can, at Musical Talk Thos. Hello, Tim.
Hello.
Now, I've been told that this old world don't mean a hill of beans.
That's true, yes, I've heard that.
But I know where beans are important. And the answer to that is...
Yes, in
South London.
47 varieties. Or 57, I forget my numbers.
Is it? I don't think Heinz have 57 different varieties of bean, do they? I think it's...
Oh, I see. Is that something else?
Yeah.
Is that tomatoes?
I don't know what 57... It's 57 Heinz varieties, isn't it? Just different things you can get from Heinz.
Oh, right. No, I'm sorry. I'm not going to be content until we know. 57 varieties. I noticed it was on Peter Duncan's costume.
Was it?
Yeah.
Oh, that's right. Well, he dresses up... But that's because he dresses up as a tomato sauce later on.
Heinz 57 is a synecdoche of the historical advertising slogan 57 varieties, about the numerous pickle products available from the Heinz company. Invented the marketing slogan 57 pickle varieties in 1896. The reason for 57 is unclear. He chose 5 because it was his lucky number, and the number 7 was his wife's lucky number. The first product to be promoted under the new 57 variety slogan was prepared horseradish.
Yum yum. Made with some real prepared horse.
1930. Oh, hang on. They did manage to make up 57. Everything from breakfast wheat to tomato juice. Anyway, sorry, right, good. I'm glad I now know the answer to that. Let's start again.
Do you want to give me a level of it?
Okay, here's the level. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. The quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog.
Bad dog.